Our next speaker is Professor Sean Rian, and Sean is speaking on the theme of recovery and transformation, investing in a new social contract. Sean is Professor of Sociology at the National University of Ireland in Maynooth and is also with the National Institute for Regional and Spatial Analysis. He has a PhD in Sociology from the University of California in Berkeley. He is recognised internationally as an expert in the politics of economic development and social inequality. His current research is on the political economy of the Celtic Tiger, high-tech regions, changes in state and governance institutions, and the politics of high-technology workplaces.
So in terms of what went wrong, I think I just want to, I suppose that the key element is financialization. I think it's important not to forget that the really, the key driver of this crisis in Ireland and internationally was the process of financialization, which is basically boils down to handing over decision-making power to private finance. And I think one of the things that's interesting is that private finance, in a sense, becomes increasingly detached from productive finance as well, from firms that are doing stuff, providing services, making stuff. And this is another feature of financialization. Obviously, in Ireland, the form that took in Ireland was in particular focused on property. But underlying that, I think there's two other sets of weaknesses. One is in the kind of the real economy. So when the bubble burst, it revealed something that I think we knew but hadn't really faced up to, the underlying weakness within the economy, the over-reliance on construction employment, and the kind of persistent weakness of indigenous domestic firms, which had improved a bit over the previous 20 years, but not to anything like the levels that were needed. And secondly, the kind of social weakness of the Irish model, which in particular meant that there were households with very low work intensity within those households. There was a low wage structure, and there was a lot of workers citizens who have been incorporated into the economy through the construction economy, but were left more or less high and dry when the bubble burst. The other side of that then is in public finances, how vulnerable we became over the 3 or 4 years running up to 2007, in particular through the use of stamp duty to bridge the gap between the kind of comparatively low tax take that we have relative to and the spending that we had at the time. So if you look internationally, I won't go through this whole table, follow Tony Fahey's advice. But I think what it does show is that, for example, banks as a percentage of profits in the whole Irish economy, Irish in the UK, Ireland's actually higher than this, 12% of all profits in the economy went to banks compared to about 5% across continental Europe. Financialisation, we had lower social spending but weaker public finances, and I think the key point is that we were weaker on these various measures of investment on the right hand side. So if you look at social investment in 2000, things like active labour market policy, education, supports for family supports for participation in the labour force and so on, Ireland and the UK come out significantly lower than the Nordics and even France, Germany and so on. Business investment in R&D, which is kind of the leading edge of the new economy, is lower as well, despite the emphasis on kind of the free market financing, venture capital and so on. And the last column shows the kind of work organisation that you have in the economy, and it shows that European firms are much more likely to use learning models of work organisation, more employee autonomy, more discretion, more training, more learning on the job, and so on, which is again another form of investment at the level of the company, the coalface of the economy. So at the end of the day, this boils down to two missing revolutions in Ireland's social and economic history. On the one hand, the weak investment relative to the rest of Europe, which was something that was a cornerstone of kind of the golden age of European capitalism from the 50s until the 70s. And secondly, a much weaker public sector much smaller, but also much weaker in terms of its legitimacy, capacity, and so on. And the other point I think I'd like to make of that is that together these also generate a weaker private sector. That the vigorous kind of private sector, the SME economy of Denmark, Germany, Austria, so on, in Europe, depended heavily on these twin pillars of an investment in firms, in workers, and so on, and that much of this was delivered through the public sector. So that this, in fact, these weaknesses on the public side and the social investment side weaken the private economy also. So the question, in a sense, then is, this is all fine and well. What might we do about this now? And so the second part of my talk, I just want to talk a little bit about, I call this investment diamond. Different elements that can be put together in the Irish economy, where we have many of the elements and the institutions in place in some form or another, so it's not simply wishful thinking, but that can be a vehicle for delivering an investment-led recovery. Because at the end of the day, I suppose investment is about taking a kind of a leap into the future. The returns are uncertain, although usually in the aggregate, are very rich returns. But they're also investment is also inherently kind of collective, I think, in the sense that the returns tend to spill over from the direct investor into the rest of the society, and this is why the public sector and the role of government is absolutely crucial in this. But again, so there's a whole social investment side. I'm going to talk primarily about what happens on the private economy side and in dealing with enterprise and so on. And I think this moves really from the macro level of macroeconomics and the fiscal strategy to the kind of middle meso level of different institutions, labour market policy, which which is about investing in labour, state investment banks, the strategic banking corporation, which is about changing capital and finance, and enterprise policy, which is about supporting and transforming firms. And then at the more micro level of firms themselves, what would a new social contract in the workplace, a new form of social partnership look like if we get to that point? So I'll just go through each of those briefly. So I won't say an awful lot about fiscal issues. They can be rehearsed at length. I do think we've had a relative, the Nevin Institute had an excellent blog post just recently about some of the trade-offs that could have been made, that fiscal consolidation has worked at some level to bring down the public deficit, but at a huge cost, and that different choices were available along the way. The thing that strikes me is that we didn't really have the capacity and over the last 5, 6, 7 years to really investigate and support an informed debate about about those choices. Certainly not from within the state. We were relying primarily on ESRI, Nevin Institute, and so on, to generate different sets of projections. So we ended up with projections from the Nevin Institute about returns to investment, analyses from the Fiscal Council about projections around what would happen if we did nothing versus fiscal consolidation and so on, but never really got from within the public system a shared set of estimates that we could at least have had a single argument around. So I think that is a crucial element, building up the capacity to do that. And I think it sounds like a technical issue, but in practical terms, it has had quite concrete effects. That's not to say that there was a silver bullet out there, but that different policy mixes were available, and that we got caught up in debates which were about slinging each other's results at each other rather than being able to really work off an integrated base of knowledge. those issues and those trade-offs will become more and more possible as the economy improves and hopefully continues to improve. But having said that, I think this middle level is absolutely crucial. And the middle level, because the middle level is where investment is delivered. We can talk about what total amount, if we got that 8 billion in tax, we can talk about what would we do with it, but also how would we deliver it. So the institutional part is absolutely crucial. And the institutional part is important for two reasons. One is to be effective, but secondly, because it generates relationships between the different parties in the society. So the money becomes a vehicle for channeling resources, but it also becomes a vehicle for a kind of a collective learning about how to do things better and so on. If it's simply a matter of just chucking the money in there, that's when bad things tend to happen in terms of getting poor returns. So I think there's three elements of this investment infrastructure. The first is around capital itself, around finance. And here we see a potentially very significant development in the last year or so, the establishment of what is effectively a state investment bank supported by KfW, which is the German investment bank. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. With the potential to transform the lending function within the society and the business lending function. Secondly, there's questions around enterprise policy and how we might extend a model that works reasonably well for a very narrow base of firms into something that will support a broader based economic development and recovery. And third, and this is probably the least promising area at the moment, is in terms of labour market policy, where we are moving reasonably firmly towards, especially for the long-term unemployed, towards a model which is based on kind of UK-style outsourcing of claimant processing versus an integrated model of employment supports, where contact with the labour market agencies becomes a focal point for the mobilisation of different resources from across the social welfare, the community, the enterprise, the education and training sectors. I won't say a huge amount more about the labour market policy, but I will return just, briefly to the other two. So if we can just say, this is again, there's a huge story here, but let me just say, if we look across the top of this table, this is really a table of what are the key institutions that support or that deliver government policy, government investment across the kind of enterprise, real economy sector. And so we're talking about how is finance delivered, how is labour trained and mobilised into the economy, where does innovation come from, and what are the supports for enterprise development, building up organisations, skills and capacities and so on. And if you look right across the top, that's their main current focus. I think an industrial system that's where the supports are mainly oriented towards foreign investment, research system are built around the various research priorities, relatively always tightening control of the HEA over universities and their spending, and an emphasis in the past at least on kind of stimulating new private sector financing rather than taking a very direct role in lending. I think if you look below those, you see some very interesting new developments. First of all, kind of at the higher end, you see this kind of state investment bank, which has the potential to generate new forms of lending, like I mentioned, and also Enterprise Ireland kind of extending out its footprint beyond the, so let's say, small software firms and biotech companies and so on, into a somewhat more diverse portfolio of firms. But the other thing that's interesting is some of the recent reforms that may or may not, depending on how we continue to develop them, become an infrastructure for really supporting the development of an indigenous domestic sector. And I think the local enterprise offices located in the county councils but formally and really will need huge amounts of support from Enterprise Ireland, but that is a possible vehicle for delivering support to local firms, linked to technological universities. Danger there is that, you know, technological universities become detached from the local societies and economies. On the side of labour, education and training, the education and training board's infrastructure, apprenticeship reforms. These are, you know, interesting developments with a lot of potential if they are pushed along. And finally, you know, in a sense, the big question is bank reform. Where does it, you know, do we end up in 5 years' time selling back the banks to the market and ending up with banks that are just as bad at business lending as they were in 2005? After the crisis, Enterprise Ireland was asked to send business development officers into the banks, basically to teach them how to lend to businesses again, because those skills have been lost within the banks. So those are key kind of issues that I think they sound, you know, they're kind of dry issues of the policy infrastructure, but it's absolutely crucial that they be pushed along and developed. That if you don't get that bottom layer of institutions put in place, resourced, built up, and so on, you will not get the kinds of supports that can turn the small company with 5 people into the company that 10 years from now is employing 75 people and exporting and so on. The third element is the what might this look like if we do get these firms and we get better training and education and so on for the workers of the society. What might this look like at the level of the firm itself? Could we imagine a different social partnership from the last, where the deal over time became the trading off of wage restraint, initially at least, for tax cuts, and, you know, effectively at the end of the day undermined the worked well in the 1990s for a while as it was balanced against growth, and the fiscal situation was quite strong, but through the 2000s in the bubble, kind of built up a bubble within the fiscal structure. And in many respects, I think it's important to say that weakness within the deal did not come from within the social partnership institutions themselves, but in many respects came from kind of party political priorities of the 2000s, and failures that were as much to do with the Department of Finance as anywhere else. But I think the key point is that the trade-off needs to be around enhanced investment rather than tax cuts. That building towards the kind of securing that 8 billion investment dividend that Sean and Michelle outlined, and then turning that into something which can be basically firms and workers get their return. You get your return in the form of a kind of collective investment dividend, in the form of you might have less money than you would have had otherwise to spend on childcare, but you may have better childcare generally available in your area, and so on. In a sense, you're asking the citizens to say, well, you know, I'll take, as recovery begins, I won't take that tax cut, but what I will take is better public services. But you're also asking the employers to deliver an upgrading of their own firms. You're asking them to do that, and at the same time you're supporting them to do that through more investment, more emphasis on enterprise policy, the use of the strategic banking corporation to deliver better investment and so on. And the question of Apple came up earlier, and it's a fascinating example because I was shocked when I read that book how many of the technologies actually had been built up through huge public investments. So Siri, the famous voice control thing that doesn't seem to understand Irish accents very well, that was funded, the original technology for it was funded in a military contract involving 20 universities, DARPA and so on. Now, it was never intended that it would be part of a widely available commercial phone. And that was the genius of Apple, to put these things together. But it's also true that Apple in no way would have been in a position to make the kinds of investments that DARPA and the universities and the state made 25 years before in order to develop that technology. It's also true that Apple is sitting on a vast pile of cash at the moment, and it's still not making those investments. So there's a key role for the public sector there. If you say, what will happen with Irish Water, is we will probably end up with the worst of all possible worlds. We will end up with no guarantee that it won't be privatised. We will end up with no incentive to control your water wastage. You will end up with something that's relatively costly, and end up something that is run along the worst private sector management lines with all kinds of bonuses and so on. Now, I think the question there is, you have to ask, what is it about our system and our debate about public utilities and public sector which generates these outcomes on a persistent basis? And I think it is about, in a sense, there's part of it which is neoliberalism and so on, but part of it is also something which is more challenging in a way for us, which is, do we as a society really, have are we willing to make the kind of collective commitment to a set of public services that is, really genuinely shared? And I don't know if, there's all kinds of problems with that on the public side, and I think it's a completely real fear that this will be privatized and so on, and that completely distorts the debate. But I also think that we haven't really, as a society, as a community, really come to terms with what that would actually mean, for all kinds of good reasons. But it's easy for us to blame everybody else about it. I think as a society and as a community, we've not really faced up to what that would actually involve. So I think we need a debate about that. It involves demanding more of the, and it's just while I have the mic. I'll say one other point about that, which is one indicator of it is, and I saw this in a piece by John McGuinness lately, where he went through the various flaws of the public sector system. And that was fine, there was 1,500 words of that. And then at the end, what should we do now? And he said, what we need now is strong governance. Now, who is going to do this strong governance? To me, it was a deeply depressing line, because I said it to my 16-year-old son, and he said, you mean like a dictator? And he kind of agreed with him, So he was like friendly to this. He said, well, yeah, like a good dictator. What's wrong with that? And I'm like, well, who's going to be your good dictator, But I think that substitutes for a genuine debate about the public sector. It also means that your public sector is less effective, because every single debate you have is about these kind of farcical things like the prime time the other night. The problem with the housing and development sector is excessive government regulation. 2006 was 7-8 years ago. So, an evidence-free zone with almost no actual evidence provided as to how government regulation was actually making it impossible to make money off 300 grand houses in Dublin. But the point is, we need to be able to have a debate about those kinds of problems with regulation without having it be a debate about should we have any public sector involvement at all. And I think that is why I say, we need a public sector debate for consenting adults who are like, all the participants are consenting to be part of this, who, in a sense, are consenting not to wreck the public sector, but to have a conversation about what is right and wrong about it as adults. So I'll leave it there.